And for more on the military strategy to take on Islamic State, I'm joined now by retired Air Force Col Cedric Leighton, a former member of the US Joint Chiefs of Staff. Colonel, thank you very much for joining me. When you hear the President say absolutely no boots on the ground and America's top military commander saying, well, they may be needed, is this a debate or a contradiction?
Well, it's very interesting, Jane, because what it really is a dose of reality that's been infused into the debate. So instead of being a contradiction on the face of it, what we're really talking about here is the military reality hitting front and center at this point. So General Dempsey's testimony in front of Congress is spot on in terms of the reality of the situation. You can achieve certain things with air power, but we have to remember we have a very fluid enemy. We have an enemy that can adapt very, very well, and it may necessitate the imposition of ground troops, and ground troops that we can trust, into that theater of war. And right now, the President has not said that we would do that. And in fact, he was, as you saw in the piece, very emphatic about not doing that. But the top military official has basically said it is a possibility and that he may ask for ground troops in the future. Yes,
as you said, he did qualify the statement by saying under certain circumstances. But what would those circumstances be?
I think, for one thing, if the air campaign was proven to be ineffective in one way or another. So what that requires is accurate intelligence on whether or not the bombing had the desired effect. So they take that as point one. The other part of it is if forces that are already in place, such as the Kurdish Peshmerga or the Free Syrian Army elements or Iraqi army elements, if those prove to be ineffective and there is some kind of a fallback or some kind of a debacle, for lack of a better term, that those forces experience, then we could absolutely see the imposition of American and perhaps UK ground forces, depending on, of course, what Parliament decides, if something like that happens. So what we're talking about here is a stopgap measure, and in essence it's a warning to ISIS saying that if you do certain things, don't be surprised. Don't be surprised if we come in with ground forces anyways.
Now, at the moment, we're presumably talking about Iraq. Could this apply equally in Syria?
I believe it can. I think, quite frankly, that the borders that were drawn, under the Sykes-Picot Agreement after World War I, that those borders are almost indefensible at this point. First of all, ISIS has said that they no longer exist in a de facto manner. Now, whether or not we choose to reestablish them, that is a question for the future. But for the moment, we have to really look at both Iraq and Syria as being one piece, because it's all one ISIS and one area that we need to go after.
Of course, airstrikes have not been ordered in Syria yet, but they are looking more likely. We're told they're not going to be shock and awe, but what would they look like?
Well, they'd be very precise. So with shock and awe, what you had was a massive bombing campaign that went after basically hundreds of very carefully selected targets. You were going after a nation state at that particular point in time, the Iraq of Saddam Hussein. Well, in this particular case, although ISIS claims to have a state in the form of the Islamic State, the reality is that we're dealing with a guerrilla army that is transitioning into a state-like army, and they're not quite there yet. So the targets are going to be different. They're going to be way more fluid, going to be a much more precise campaign with far fewer targeting elements than we had during shock and awe.
Colonel Leighton, thank you very much for joining me.
Thank you, Jane. Thanks so much for having me.